watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Wednesday evening doing our second show here for the day. We have Jake Brancatella, who is a convert to Islam, and also Louis Dizon, who is a returning guest. And in fact, what Louis is going to be doing is guest hosting RNT tonight. So what I'm going to do is pass it over to him, and I'll probably be back in about 45 minutes. But gentlemen, both of y'all, welcome to the show. And Louis, I'm passing it on to you.
Thank you.
All right. Excellent. Hey, it's good to have you here, Jake. I've been watching your material for quite a while now, and I'm happy to have you on this show to hear, your perspective on theology, religion from an Islamic perspective. Now, for those who do not know you, I just want to take a minute to read Jake's biography. So Jake Brancatella is a Muslim apologist and debater. He holds a BA in philosophy and has studied and continues to study the traditional Islamic sciences such as Fiqh and Aqeedah with various scholars. His main areas of interest are Christian and Islamic theology and philosophy of religion. So, I think that about covers all of the basics. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you are also working on, you're currently doing either a master's or a PhD, is that correct?
I am pursuing it, yes.
Okay, like a PhD.
Yes.
Awesome. And it's in philosophy.
Yes.
Oh, well, that's great. I'm actually in a PhD program as well, so, but completely different field, so I know what that's like. But anyway,
what are you pursuing?
So I'm in the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations. My focus is on comparative polemics between the Abrahamic faiths during the Middle Ages, and I'm focusing specifically on the work of Ibn Hazm, the Andalusian polemicist from the 11th century. So, so I'm reading a bunch of his works and commentaries on his work and comparing it with other literature from that time period. But anyway, we didn't come here to listen to me, but to hear your side of the story. So, people who are in Christian Muslim apologetics are always interested to hear convert stories, and we've actually had Muslim to Christian convert stories here, but I don't think we've had any Christian to Muslim convert stories yet. So we'd love to hear your story of how you embraced Islam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So unless there's anything else, I guess I'll just start off by explaining sort of my upbringing and how I eventually wound up where I am now as a Muslim. So virtually all my family is Roman Catholic. So I was raised to be a Roman Catholic. I went to Sunday school, was baptized, made my communion, all these things. I actually was never confirmed. I kind of got kicked out of Sunday school somehow right before confirmation because I was a naughty boy, I guess. And so I was never confirmed. But like I said, I went to Catholic school when I was young, just until I was, I don't know, maybe 7 years old, not too long, before I switched to public school. So, I was raised to be a Catholic, and kind of skipping forward, because I don't want to bore the audience too much. When I was in high school, I had a good friend of mine was Muslim, and interestingly enough, I wasn't really into religion or anything. I always believed in God, but Catholicism specifically or even Christianity more broadly. I never took much interest in it, to be quite honest with you. And my friend, who I said was Muslim in high school, we never really got into religious discussions much. But somehow or another, he brought up Islam to me, and he started talking to me about it, and I kind of just brushed it off. I didn't take it too seriously. But eventually, I got around to reading the Quran, and specifically, originally, my intent was actually to refute my friend and the Quran itself. I didn't really know very much of anything about Islam or the Quran. But yeah, I sort of had a malicious intent in the beginning. And obviously, I'm not telling every single thing in the story, but fast forwarding a little bit further, I eventually became a Muslim from just reading the Quran by myself, primarily because of the theology that I found in the text was quite appealing to me, and that many of the difficulties and questions I had surrounding Christian theology, the Quran provided or substituted answers to those problems and questions that I thought were much more reasonable, and obviously I think they're correct. So, and that was, let's see, maybe about 10 years ago. That's when I initially became a Muslim. And when I first became Muslim, because I didn't really know anything about the religion, I was what's called a Quranist, which is basically in the Islamic tradition. Typically, we have two sources. One, which is the Quran, which is the word of God for Muslims, obviously, and then also another body of literature or source, which is called the Sunnah. And it's mostly found in Hadith. So I didn't know about this other source called Sunnah, and I was a Quranist, which meant that I only thought that the Quran was the sole legitimate authority in the religion. It's kind of a rough comparison, obviously not exactly the same, but it would be similar to the distinction between Protestants and Catholics. And again, it's not a one-for-one comparison, but in the way that Catholics accept tradition besides the Bible, and Protestants don't really, at least not to the extent that Catholics do anyway. So I was just completely in a minority position in the beginning, because the overwhelming majority of Muslims, whether Sunni or Shia, they accept some form of the Sunnah or tradition besides the Quran as an authority. And they may have certain differences over exactly what that is, what the content of it is, but they agree on that basic fact that there is something else that Muslims need to appeal to or follow besides the Quran itself. So anyway, again, fast forwarding, I was a Quranist, and sort of a very hardcore one for quite some time, maybe I would say about 7 years or so. I don't know the exact number, but a good amount of time for my 20s. And then about 3 years ago, it's going on about 3 years ago now, I transitioned into a form of traditional Sunni Islam. And again, I'm leaving out some details, but largely because I thought that the arguments for the Quranist position and against Sunnism, or more broadly accepting an authority besides the Quran known as the Sunnah, I didn't think they were good anymore. I thought that there were serious problems with the Quranist view, and maybe if you have questions about it, we can go into more detail later on. So that's where I've been for the past 3 years. I'm a traditional Sunni Muslim now for the past 3 years. And that's just a brief synopsis of sort of my intellectual and faith journey from a young guy to, being Catholic, eventually becoming a Quranist, and then eventually becoming a more traditional Muslim Sunni. Now, I know that you had mentioned, or maybe there was an expectation. I guess I should have prepared, but I didn't know that, to be quite honest with you, of arguments that I was expected to give for specifically my religion, Islam, or even more specifically, Sunni Islam. But what I would just say, because I thought it was mainly about why I converted, the main reasons why I converted, and I still hold them as valid today, are primarily based on Islamic theology. So the distinction, for those who don't know, between Christianity as it's conceived, especially Catholicism, and Islam, the main difference, starting from the beginning with who God is this concept or doctrine of the Trinity versus an Islamic notion or conception of God, which we would call Tawheed, in which, to use Christian terminology, there aren't three persons of God, there's one person, even though we don't really use that term, just for people to understand what the distinction is. So that's the first difference. And for me, the Trinity never really made much sense. It still doesn't to me today. The various models and conceptions of them, of the Trinity, I think all suffer from one problem or another, whether it be logically, whether it be biblically, or certain metaphysical things. So that's the first thing. Second thing is the Incarnation, which also was a bit perplexing for me, which I had trouble understanding how Christ, and this has to do more specifically with who Christ is, how he could be fully God and fully man simultaneously. It didn't make much sense to me, still doesn't today. And so I do a lot of time thinking about it, reading about these doctrines, and interviewing Christian scholars, and even debating some of them on my YouTube channel. And then the third doctrine, and this is what I would call the big three of Christianity, is the notion of the atonement of Christ, the fact that Christ died for the sins of all the guilty. And at the very basics, and again, I'm just giving broad strokes here, it's an innocent man dying for the sins of all the guilty. I find that problematic, and it doesn't make much sense to me. So Islam, on the other hand, does not have those doctrines. It has a particular view of God, in which he would be one person with real attributes. And so it's a rejection of divine simplicity, which is another thing that I also have difficulty understanding. I don't think that divine simplicity makes very much sense at all. And so that's another distinction between, anyway, I mean, the classical version of Christianity and Islam. Islam, pretty much the orthodox version of it, in terms of at least the Sunni orthodoxy, has rejected divine simplicity. So that's another important difference. And so I want to say that's just a comparison between Christianity and Islam. But why Islam in general? Why not atheism or Judaism or Hinduism? Well, it would take a lot of time to sort of critique all of them individually. But what I would say is, I think I start from a very basic presupposition or metaphysical axiom that our rational faculties are reliable, and they are reliable tools for acquiring knowledge and seeking truth. And if that's the case, well, I would be able to use them to a certain degree to interact with the world. And I think this is a point where Catholics and Muslims actually agree, is that we're able to, from this faculty that God has given us and creation itself, we're able to deduce that a creator exists. And then we're also able to deduce certain attributes, at least in the Islamic tradition, of the creator, things like having knowledge and power, just by the mere fact that he was able to create the world and with the complexity that exists in the universe. And so anyway, the reason I'm bringing this up is because through what's called natural theology, I think that we arrive at a conception of God which is much more congruent with the Muslim conception of God than a Christian conception of God or any other conception of God other than maybe arguably Judaism. So it's pretty much going to narrow it down to the Abrahamic and monotheistic faiths such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But then I think Christianity has problems with the Trinity and also with something called the doctrine of divine processions, in which the Son and the Spirit are, and there are different expressions of it, but this is one way it's been expressed, caused to exist, although atemporally, so eternally in the past. And so there's a sort of asymmetrical dependency relationship between the Father and the Son and the Spirit. And so the Son and the Spirit depend upon the Father in a way that the Father doesn't depend on them for their existence. As St. Athanasius says, they don't have being in and of themselves. It's through another, namely the Father. And so for me, that's problematic because of the fact that through natural theology arguments, we arrive at what's called an uncaused cause, or what Aristotle called a prime mover. And because of that, it rules out, as far as I'm able to tell, the existence of the Son or Spirit because they're not uncaused causes. Those arguments arrive back at only the existence of the Father, and they're also incompatible with the existence of the Son and the Spirit being God. And if that's the case, and actually this played out in one of my debates with Dr. Joshua Sijuade, he defended the classical doctrine of divine processions espoused by the Nicene Creed. And I said to him, well, if this is the case, the arguments that you would use from natural theology to get to a creator or a first cause means that you would conclude or arrive only at the existence of the Father. And he said, yes. Well, that's just the bullet that we have to bite. So for me, that's also problematic. And so I'm kind of left with and again, this is just a quick sketch. So I'm kind of left with a choice between Islam and Judaism. I think Judaism has serious problems as far as the text of the Old Testament goes and its reliability, as well as what I see and what modern scholarship, much of modern scholarship anyway, on the Old Testament is that's gone through many sort of revisions and redactions. And I see anyway, in the Old Testament, I don't see a clear and consistent message. There seems to be different ideas from different authors that at times conflict with one another. So anyway, this is by sort of a process of elimination. I'm arriving at Islam specifically, primarily, as I said, because of its conformity with natural theology, and that the supposed gap anyway, between natural theology and Islam and any other religion, I'd argue is the smallest. And so the leap from natural theology to Islam is very small. Whereas all of these other metaphysical claims and systems, whether it be the Trinity, Incarnation, or Hinduism, and all these other things, it's just so many metaphysical claims that you need to take on board that complicate the picture that I don't think are necessary. And so I think Islam is the simplest, and I would say, again, the closest and in most conformity with natural theology itself. So that's how I started off, and that's how I ended in becoming a Muslim. Now, since then, I have studied much more of the Islamic tradition and faith, and realized that there are other things that motivate and could motivate one to become a Muslim or to remain a Muslim. But I'm not really going to go into those much, because I think it would be kind of cheap for me to bring them up, especially considering the fact that I didn't know about them really when I converted. So I'm not going to try to take that knowledge that I attained afterwards and sort of back project it. I don't think that that would really be fair in explaining why I became a Muslim. So yeah, I think that's just a brief explanation of how and why I became a Muslim, and why I think it is, the most consistent position to hold. And yeah, that's about it.
All right. That was very good. Thank you for sharing all of that, Jake. So, it's clear that you did spend a lot of time thinking about this very carefully. And, obviously, we've arrived at different conclusions, but I always respect somebody who is doing their best to honestly look at the evidence and try to follow it where it leads. And I believe that you are that sort of person. That being said, I do have some misgivings about Islam. And even though I've been studying it for the better part of like maybe 12, 13 years at this point, I'm still nowhere close to being convinced by it. But I think maybe a good thing to do at this point is for me to give a little bit of my own background, because like you, I also grew up Catholic, and I also spent a significant portion of my life away from the Catholic faith. The main difference is that at a later point I ended up returning to it, but that's a story for another day. But I was an atheist for maybe like a few months when I was a teenager, and then after that I was a evangelical Protestant for 11 years of my life before I ultimately returned to being Catholic. And one of the interesting things that happened to me around high school, I think it was grade 11 and grade 12, was that I had my first real engagements with Muslims. Now, I'm from the Philippines and we have Muslims there, but I never really had religious discussions with Muslims back in the Philippines. It was only when I moved to Canada that I started having those discussions. And the first real discussions I had were with members of the Ahmadi sect, which I realize most mainstream Muslims don't regard as actually Muslim, but there were these two Pakistani Ahmadi guys in my high school, and they were very eager to talk about religion with me, and they actually gave me this book. Its title was, I believe, Christianity, Journey from Facts to Fiction. It was written by one of their previous leaders, Mirza Tahir Ahmad, and it purported to show why Christianity was false and why Islam, specifically the Ahmadiyya interpretation of Islam, was true. Now, I read this book and I was like, something here doesn't seem quite right. So whenever I would come across a claim in this book, I would go on the internet and start researching this claim. And I found that a lot of the things that they were saying didn't quite add up. And this led me to begin studying Islam in depth. So I started reading the Quran and I started listening to Christian Muslim debates on the internet. And after I finished high school, I got interested enough in this topic that I decided to study it at an academic level. So I went to the University of Toronto, got a BA in Near and Middle Eastern civilizations with a focus on both biblical studies and Islamic studies. And then eventually I found myself doing a PhD program in that same field, which is what I'm doing today. Now, all of that being said, I've had a lot of time to think about this particular topic of, there are two major religions in the world that try to convince all of the world that this is the way, and those are Christianity and Islam. So I had a lot of conversations with Muslims about why they believe Christianity is false, why they believe Islam is true. And a lot of the times they revolve around negative arguments against Christianity. And I know that a lot of the debates that you have with Christian apologists, Jake, revolve around the coherence of the Trinity and the Incarnation. However, first of all, I'm not going to delve too much into the philosophical part because my training in philosophy consists of having taken a single introductory level survey course, plus having read a few primary sources for myself. But I have studied the issue in depth from biblical and a historical perspective. So I'm well versed in those facets of the debate over those issues. And I don't know if you saw, but I did a presentation here a while back on how actually a lot of the Christian ideas about the Trinity and the Incarnation have their origins in Second Temple Judaism. So I think that from that perspective, a lot of these Christian beliefs actually do have a basis in the historical background, the Jewish historical background, which they emerged. And even if all of this was false, by the way, so there's a difference between showing that standard classical Christianity is false and showing that Islam is true. And the way I think about it is that, if a Unitarian or a Jewish person can make the exact same argument that you make, then it's probably not a good argument in favor of Islam because another religion can make it. And I know that you alluded to, Judaism having problems of its own. We can discuss that if you like, but perhaps I could mention some of the problems that I've found in my study with Islam. But before I do that, I just wanted to give you a chance to comment if you have any thoughts that you wanted to share.
Well, I just have actually two questions. You can answer them quickly if you want. I'm just wondering what actually caused you to become an atheist for a brief period, and again, what caused you to transition from Protestantism to back to Catholicism? I'm just curious.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be okay. So the atheist part is a little bit embarrassing. I read Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion. I realize in hindsight that there were some really bad arguments for atheism, but I was 16 years old. I didn't know any better. I had no exposure to theistic apologetics at the time. So not having had a proper rebuttal to those kinds of arguments, I actually found them convincing for a while. And I was hearing a lot of this new atheist stuff back when it was still fresh and not like, just the same old tired slogans repeated over and over. But it didn't take very long for me to wisen up and realize these are some really not good arguments. And of course, at the same time, I was starting to get exposed to Christian apologetics while I was in that unbelieving phase, and a lot of it was apologetics in favor of Christianity, and specifically in the sense that it's not just for the existence of God, but for the reliability of the Gospels. I read stuff like Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ, which, for most people is pretty introductory level apologetics, but for me it was helpful because it gave me a bit of groundwork to show, how, from a Christian perspective, one might believe that the Bible is reliable. Now, how I ended up going from Protestantism back to Catholicism, that one is a much longer story. I've always been hounded by Catholic friends during my 11-year sojourn. As a Protestant, they were aware of the fact that I had a Catholic upbringing and tried to convince me to return to the faith. And for a while, I was arguing back with them on that, but over time, it was becoming more difficult to sustain some of the arguments that I was making. So I was a big fan of James White, somebody that you would know as well. And you know that before
Yeah.
James White yeah, before he had all those debates with Muslims, his main debate opponents were Catholics. So he had a lot of debates with Catholic apologists like Robert St. Genis, Jimmy Akin, Father Mitch Pacwa, etc. So I listened to all of them, and um, some of them he did better than others. There were a few that really got me thinking. Maybe Catholicism has more to it than I initially gave it credit for. And one of the major debates that I think really did it for me was when he debated Trent Horn on the question of can a Christian lose their salvation, because I was a pretty hardcore Calvinist at the time, but listening to him debate Trent Horn made me realize that, a lot of these arguments for Reformed theology don't hold up very well. And at the same time, I was also having a lot of friends who were crossing the Tiber, which is, a colloquialism for converting to Catholicism. And I was trying to argue, trying to dissuade them from doing that. But, my attempts to dissuade them from becoming Catholic, well, first of all, it wasn't convincing them. Second, the more I thought about it, the more I realized, they weren't convincing to myself either. So at a certain point, I just had to, accept that the truth really pointed in the direction of Catholicism, and I returned to the faith of my upbringing.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't trying to pick any battles with it. I was just curious. That's all.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, so I'm actually going to mention some problems that I have with Islam, particularly from my reading of the Quran. And I know that in one of your past videos, you did mention that one of the arguments that a Muslim may use to prove the truth of Islam are certain features in the Quran that point to their authenticity. Before I make the negative case, I was wondering if maybe you would like to present a positive case for the Quran first.
A positive case for the Quran with regards to what?
Like, what features of the Quran would you say point to its authenticity as a divine revelation from God?
Well, based on what I was saying before, I think that for me, I guess my name might give it away. I'm much more interested in metaphysics and theology. So the theology of the Quran, specifically to me, when it comes to God himself and his prophets, I think is correct. I think it's quite convincing. So that's where I start. Then in the video that you mentioned, there are certain linguistic features of the Quran that have been argued in the Islamic tradition as miraculous. But as I said earlier, when I became a Muslim, I wasn't really aware so much of the depth of this or the argument itself. And so that wasn't really the primary reason or even secondary reason why I became a Muslim. That's why I just didn't think it was really fair to bring up.
Fair enough. But, because I think this is more helpful for me in particular, because as I probably indicated in how I ended up being interested in Christian Muslim apologetics, it was less the philosophical side of it as it was like the textual and the historical side. So me like reading the Quran and, and looking into Muslim history, the hadiths, etc. And if it's okay with you, I just want to mention a couple of the things that I have found in my studies of the Quran that disincline me from believing that it's God's word. And perhaps if you like, you can respond to what I have to say. So,
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So, one of the things
Let me just
that,
get my. You can continue talking. I'm just going to get my Quran, though.
All right, fair enough. You can do that. So when I read the Quran, I find that one of the major arguments that it presents in favor of its divine revelation is what Muslims would call ijaz al-Quran, or the fancy Latin term is inimitability of the Quran. So it argues that even if all of mankind and all of the jinns were to get together, they would not be able to produce a surah like it. And a lot of Muslims will interpret this to mean that the eloquence of the Quran is something of a linguistic miracle, and this proves that it is the word of God. However, I think that those who have studied the Quran have found that this idea of the ijaz al-Quran, the idea of the Quran being incredibly eloquent, and this proving the divinity, its divine origin, that's to put it mildly, it is a debatable topic, and a lot of people have pointed out what appear to be flaws in it. So I have in my book I have in my hand a book called 23 Years, a study of the prophetic career of Muhammad, by a person named Ali Dashti. He's actually a former Muslim who ended up becoming an atheist, and in this book he provides some of his observations from having studied the life of Muhammad and the Quran. And I just want to cite something that he says here. In pages 48 to 49, he says this: the Quran contains sentences which are incomplete and not fully intelligible without the aid of commentaries, foreign words, unfamiliar Arabic words, and words used with other than the normal meaning, adjectives and verbs inflected without observance of the concords of gender and number, illogically and ungrammatically applied pronouns which sometimes have no referent, and predicates which in rhymed passages are often remote from the subjects. These and other such aberrations in the language have given scope to critics who deny the Quran's eloquence. The problem also occupied the minds of devout Muslims. It forced the commentators to search for explanations, and is probably one of the causes of disagreement over readings. And one of the things that I've done during my undergrad years was to do study of Arabic. So I've learned to read the Quran in Arabic, and I've found that some of these issues which don't immediately come up if you read the text in an English translation become much more apparent if you read in Arabic. So, for example, in Surah 26:16, it says this: فَأَتِيَا فِرْعَوْنَ فَقُولَ إِنَّا رَسُولُ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Now, those who can read the Arabic will note something curious about this, which is that you have a plural we here, and that's because it's Moses and Aaron that's in view in the context. However, the word that comes after it is Rasul, which is rather odd because Rasul is the singular form of the word for messenger. If this were to be grammatically correct, the text would have to have either the plural form Rusul or the dual form Rasulan or Rasulain. But the fact that it appears as the singular form Rasul has been pointed out by many people to be an example of a grammatical error in the Quran. And also, the Quran, for those who have read it in Arabic, often tries to use rhyme structure, and it's hard not to notice it if you hear it chanted. But sometimes the Quran will attempt to keep that rhyme structure at the expense of good grammar. One example of this is in Surah 37:130, and I'm going to start a couple of verses before the one I want to cite. So, it says here, إِلَّا عِبَادَ اللَّهِ الْمُخْلِصِينَ وَتَرَكْنَا عَلَيْهِ فِي الْآخِرِينَ سَلَامٌ عَلَى الْيَاسِينَ إِنَّا كَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ. So notice that it all ends with in at the end of each verse. Now, interestingly, verse 130 has mention of Ilyasin, which is supposed to be Ilyas, except that Ilyas, for some reason here, has the plural ending in it. And contrast that with verse 122 in the same surah, where it says, Wa inna Ilyas liman al-mursilin. So Ilyas there appears in the proper singular form, as it does every other instance, but the Quran mysteriously and arbitrarily changes it to Ilyasin in verse 130 just to keep its rhyme structure. And it does so in such a way that it doesn't make for good grammar. And then one final example that I want to bring up is Surah 47:19. So it says there, فَأَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَّهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. So this is not immediately obvious if you just read through it, but in the word annahu, there is the pronominal suffix hu attached there, and that pronominal suffix is actually, interestingly, it's somewhat redundant because it has no clear reference in its context. It would make more grammatical sense if it simply said fa'alam anna la ilaha illallah. So the fact that this grammatical anomaly exists there, to me, it seems like it sounds syntactically awkward. And to me, it goes against the idea that this is the best, the most eloquent Arabic there is. And I also want to mention the historical issues that I found with the Quran, but maybe you'd like to say something.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a lot. You're going through numerous different supposed grammatical errors in the Quran. Obviously, I wasn't prepared for that for this interview. I didn't know that that's what we were going to do. Secondly, I'm definitely not an expert on Quranic grammar or Arabic grammar in general. In terms of my Arabic, just for you and the audience as well, I will consider myself a beginner in Arabic. I can read the text, but in terms of the grammar and explaining away these supposed problems, I think you brought on the wrong person for that, to be quite honest with you. But on the first point that you mentioned, I'll just read something because I've actually looked at this before. I think you were mentioning the word Rasul, which was in, what was it, chapter 26:16.
Yeah.
Yeah. In this article, and if you want the link, I can send it. It goes over this and it talks about, it says the usage of the singular form of Rasul. As for the usage of the singular form of Rasul in the ayah as opposed to the dual form, this is acceptable in the Arabic language, and the scholars of tafsir mention linguistic proofs for this type of usage in the works of tafsir. Upon explaining the soundness of the usage of the singular, as in this case, they mention that the word Rasul in its linguistic usage is a verbal noun, mastar, which has a shared meaning indicating both the meaning risala, or message/mission, as well as mursal, messenger or something sent. This being the case, as they demonstrate with various other words in Arabic, then its usage in the singular, dual, or plural forms is acceptable, and it cites Baydawi, Abu Hayyan, Ibn Ashur, and others. So the other examples that you mentioned, I don't even really remember them that clearly, but I would just say that I think the answers, if you're really looking for answers to these questions, you're probably brought on the wrong person to discuss those things, because I am not an expert in Arabic grammar. So the only thing that I can do is refer to experts, and I'm quoting an expert who's actually contradicting what you said and what I think you read in the book, although the book I don't think, at least in what you read, gave specific examples. So as far as I'm able to tell, we're kind of at a stalemate. I don't think that I'm going to be able to adjudicate that difference just because I'm only able to appeal to experts other than myself.
That's fair. That's totally fair. You're allowed to do that. The reason why I brought it up is because I remember that at least one of the arguments that you made was a linguistic argument. So, I figured. And also, I think the other reason why I brought this up is because it's the argument the Quran makes for itself. If you read the Quran and it tries to argue for itself being God's word, the main argument it presents for itself is the fact that no one can produce anything like it.
Yeah, no one can produce anything like it. That's right. But if you know even a little bit about the subject, even the supposed miracle of the Quran, there's difference of opinion of what that actually refers to and how it's cashed out. Yeah, I don't know exactly what you want me to say, because I do see it as a bit strange that you would bring me on here to ask me these questions without any type of notice, and with knowing that it's not at all my area of specialty.
That's totally fair. I mean, maybe I apologize a little bit. Maybe I should have run it by you first, but I thought that might be something. I just wanted to see how you would react to it. I'm not gonna bring up the historical issues because I think that the audience may have some questions of their own. So I want to transition to the Q&A portion of this because I know a lot of people want to have questions for you. But before I do, there were a couple of people who have questions, but they weren't able to make it tonight. They wanted to submit to me their questions in advance. So I was wondering if I can give you the questions that they provided, pick your brain on them.
Sure, if I'm able to answer them.
Fair. All right. So the first one is from Dustin Quick, who is actually a past guest here at Reason and Theology, and he's also he's actually a former Muslim who became a Christian, and his question is this. So it's a bit long, so it'll take me a minute to read.
You said he became a Catholic, or?
Yeah, he's a Catholic. So his question is, what happens to Islam's claim to be the continuation and consummation of the same religion of the people of the book, when proper prominence is given to the theology and cult of the Jerusalem temple and the Melchizedek priest king and the eternal covenant? Jesus' divinity is based on the theology of the first temple, not Greco-Roman paganism or the supposed heresies of Paul. In the context of the temple theology of the scriptures, defining features like multiple hypostases in the Godhead, theosis, the Lord in human form on earth, the Son of the Highest, are all blasphemy in Islam. How can Islam be the authentic expression of the deen given to Bani Israel when this is the bedrock of Israel's most ancient faith?
I mean, what was the question? It was kind of long.
So if I can shorten it, basically, how do you respond to the argument that many of these features of Christian theology, such as the Incarnation, God being multiple hypostases, has precedent in ancient Jewish beliefs?
How do I explain why it has precedent? Is that the question?
Yeah. How would you respond to this argument, basically? And how can Islam be true in light of it?
Well, obviously, there are other Jewish interpretations that would not grant that. It's a particular interpretation which the person is assuming. And even if that were the case, I don't see what it has to do with the truthfulness of the claim at all. I guess I'm at a loss as to why it has anything to do with whether or not Jesus is actually God.
Well, I think the reason why it's brought up is because one of the arguments for Christianity is that it is a fulfillment of what comes before it. That Judaism has these rooted ideas that find their fullest expression in the Christian faith.
Yeah, and if you actually do some research and look at the literature on it, from what I'm able to tell, is that the authors will actually tell you that these things which are claiming to be rooted in Judaism were actually previously rooted in paganism and are a fob off from that. So I don't think it's actually a good thing for Christians to appeal to it, because if they want, then they're seemingly endorsing paganism and polytheism.
Right. Do you have any specific literature or scholars that you can mention that make this argument?
Not offhand, but I know that what's the Jewish scholar's name? Not, was it Benjamin Summer? I don't really know off the top of my head, but
Benjamin Sommer.
yeah.
Yeah, like he does mention some of this, although I don't think
I do-
he would say that it comes from paganism. Anyway, we'll skip that one and go to the next question. This one is from Chris Claus. So he asks this. You deny atonement in the Bible because Muslims claim one person cannot bear the sins of another. Yet in Sahih Muslim and Bukhari, as well as the Hadith Qudsi, it states Muslims will come with sins heaped like mountains, and God will remove their sin and place it upon Jews and Christians and allow the Muslim paradise. How can you be consistent in denying the Bible but accepting these Hadith?
I don't know the Hadith offhand. I would have to look at it.
Okay, so just for information, there is this hadith that occurs in Sahih Muslim where it says that Muslims will come on the day of judgment with with sins like as high as a mountain, and then God will basically take their sins and put Jews and Christians in hellfire in their place. So I think that's the hadith that Chris is referring to.
Yeah, I can't comment on it. I would have to look at the
Okay.
Hadith.
Fair enough. I'll try to send you the reference, but if you're not familiar with it, I'll let the matter go. Now that that's done, I'm going to. Oh, there's Michael is back. So I believe this is the part where we transition to the audience Q&A. Because I can't do the thing where you highlight specific comments, but perhaps Michael can do that for me.
Yeah, looking through it right now. Make sure to send them to @Reason in Theology, because I'm seeing mostly comments. If there's any questions in here, you got to tag me. So make sure to send it to @Reason in Theology. Do you see any there in the chat? Louis, did you spot any?
I think there were a couple of questions. This is not one specific person, but there are a couple of questions asking about Jake's specific theology, like does he adhere to Mutazilism or Maturidism or something else, or something more eclectic? Perhaps Jake could answer that question.
No, I don't hold to a particular school of thought on theology. Depends on what the specific issue is.
McVine asks, which Trinitarian scholar does Jake read and recommend?
Which scholar do I read?
Which Trinitarian scholar?
Yeah, there's many. So I have my book back there, which is Philosophical and Theological Essays on the Trinity, which goes through a lot of the issues that I discuss. There are many different authors in it. Peter Van Inwagen, William Lane Craig, Brian Leftow. So, I mean, I don't know.
Okay. What do early Muslim scholars and philosophers think about Jake's view on God existing in time?
What do early Muslim scholars and philosophers think about Jake's view on God existing in time? Well, as far as I know, although I've been doing more research on it lately, this wasn't really discussed. The issue of whether or not God was in time wasn't really discussed early on. So it's a bit anachronistic to really speak about. But the bulk of the tradition from when it started being discussed up until now would reject God being in time or changing. Although they would allow for certain relational changes or what would be called Cambridge changes.
Jai Apologetics asks, does the Quran depend on Allah? And if so, is it still fully divine? Is the speech of Allah fully divine?
Can you just leave that up there again
Mhm.
so I can see it? Does the Quran depend on Allah? And if so, is it still fully divine? Is the speech of Allah fully divine? I mean, the question is kind of strange because I don't know anyone who says that the Quran is fully divine. So I think the question is just kind of off from the beginning.
Giovanni asks, what are Jake's thoughts on the Muslim belief regarding the crucifixion of Jesus? Was this a major hurdle in your conversion to Islam?
No, it was not a major hurdle. What are my thoughts on Islam's position on it?
Mhm.
Is that the question?
Right.
I think it's correct. I think that without going into too much detail, I think that the Quran is pretty ambiguous on it. It simply says that the Jews claim that they killed the Messiah, and actually negates, from my understanding of it, two types of killing. One being killing by any means, and I think is specifically denying stoning to death, which the Jews had as their method of execution, and also death by crucifixion. Denies both of them. And I think, interestingly enough, we see both of those examples in the Bible itself. For example, when Paul discusses that anyone who hangs on a tree is cursed, if you go back and actually look at the cross reference for that passage in Deuteronomy, the Jews had this idea of killing somebody and then hanging the corpse in a tree. And so I think the Quran is denying both of those. And yeah, I affirm that position.
BDA Productions asks, can Jake elaborate on the middle argument?
I'm not really sure what that's referring to.
I think
There's,
it has to do with the one argument that you made about how in one surah of the Quran, the word middle occurs in the exact middle of the surah.
Oh, right. Yeah. That's in chapter 2. Let's see. Where is it here? 140, 143. Yeah, it says, and thus we have made you a middle or just community, that you will be witnesses over the people, and the messenger will be a witness over you. I think they're referring to, I briefly mentioned that in one of my videos, and the Quran in that surah or chapter has 286 verses. The word middle basically appears in the middle of the chapter, specifically in that verse. So that was just a part of the discussion in that video.
Last one here. How is Islam a continuation of Judaism and Christianity when they threw out the everlasting priesthood and temple sacrifice?
A continuation of Judaism and Christianity when they throw out the everlasting priesthood and temple sacrifice. Well, I think it presupposes a certain understanding of Islam's understanding of continuation. Islam does not say that, for example, in chapter 5, I think it's verse 48 here. Let me just get it for you. Yeah. So it says, and we have revealed to you, O Muhammad, the book, i.e. the Quran, in truth concerning that which preceded it of the scripture, and as a criterion over it. So judge between them by what Allah has revealed, and do not follow their inclinations away from what has come to you of the truth. To each of you were prescribed a law and a method. Had Allah willed, he would have made you one nation united in religion, but he intended to test you in what he has given you. So race to all that is good. To Allah is your return altogether, and he will then inform you concerning that over which you used to differ. So it clearly mentions in the Quran anyway that each previous community was given a specific law and way and revelation as well. And the Quran has no problem in abrogating previous whether it be text or tradition from previous religions.
Lewis, did you have any final questions
Nope.
or comments?
I think that we've. Let me see. Let me just. Okay, there is. So MK Vine asked a question. How does Jake reconcile Allah being loving, which is self-giving, with his Unitarian nature? Whom was Allah loving for all eternity?
Yeah, I have an entire video on this, so people can go check on my channel about, I think the video is called "Is the Trinity Necessary?" And you see modern, some modern Trinitarians, most, as far as I'm able to tell, Trinitarian philosophers would not even agree with the argument because it has certain assumptions. So the argument is basically that in order for God to be loving, he must be multi-personal or have another person to love. Otherwise, he's deficient. First thing is that it assumes what's called a three-self Trinity model. If people want, they can check out Dale Tuggie's entry on Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. He divides Trinity models between one-self and three-self models. And it assumes a three-self model, which leans more towards social Trinitarianism, which, from my perspective, leads to polytheism. And so I don't really think it's a good argument for many reasons, but one of which, it actually doesn't include a lot of the early tradition. For example, St. Augustine's model, and I'd argue that the classical Catholic model of the Trinity leans more towards a one-self model, especially when you consider the analogies that are given about the Trinity. For example, that the Father is, for example, the lover, the Son is the beloved, and the Spirit is love itself, or you do the same thing with knowledge. And the way that that's actually explained is God loving himself. And so he's not loving another in the sense of there being three distinct selves. He's actually loving himself. Well, if that's inadequate, then we have to say that, I'm sorry, but, saints of the Catholic Church of the past just completely had a deficient doctrine of the Trinity. I don't think we want to say that about them. So that's just one example that I think the argument depends on a three-self version of the Trinity, which even most Christians, or I shouldn't say most, but many Christians wouldn't endorse.
All right, Jake, any parting words or plugs that you want to put in for any of your material?
No, not really. People can check out my channel, The Muslim Metaphysician, on YouTube. I'm also part of another channel called Thought Adventure Podcast, or TAP for short, with 3 other Muslims. And we usually have discussions with atheists. We primarily focus on atheism, although we do talk about Christianity and stuff there. So those are the 2 podcasts that I'm a part of, or channels on YouTube, my own, and then Thought Adventure Podcast. People are free to check those out if they want.
Excellent. Well, thanks for coming on and doing this. And Lewis, also thank you for guest hosting there. I appreciate that.
Yep, it was my pleasure.
And everybody, thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already to the channel. Also, check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support what we're doing. Until next time, God bless.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause,